When 72-year-old Eleanor Voss heard the rumble of motorcycle engines outside her small brick house on Maple Street in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, her first instinct was to close the curtains and pretend she wasn't home. She'd lived in that house for 43 years, raised 2 children there, buried a husband from that front porch, and spent the last 7 years watching the neighborhood change around her while she slowly disappeared from view. What she didn't know was that the man climbing off that Harley Davidson, a 58-year-old road captain named Thomas Ridge Carter with the Heartland Riders MC, wasn't there by accident. He was there because a 9-year-old girl named Sophie had noticed something the entire neighborhood had missed, that an elderly woman's mailbox had been overflowing for 3 days, that her newspapers were piling up on the walkway, and that the lights in her house never seemed to turn on anymore. What started as a child's observation would become a rescue of a different kind, not from immediate danger, but from something just as deadly. The slow erasure that happens when someone stops mattering to the world around them. The Heartland Riders MC had been doing their monthly neighborhood patrol through the older sections of Cedar Rapids, a community service program they'd started 5 years earlier after a series of break-ins had targeted elderly residents. 6 bikes rolling through residential streets at careful speeds, riders making eye contact with people on porches, waving at kids, being a visible presence that said someone was watching, someone cared. Ridge was 58 years old, president of the Cedar Rapids chapter, a man with silver streaking through his dark hair and a face that had been weathered by 30 years of riding in all conditions. He'd been a Marine, done 2 tours in the First Gulf War, come home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with veterans who'd seen things they couldn't talk about. He'd found his family in the MC, men who understood that brotherhood meant showing up, that service didn't end when you took off the uniform, that community was something you built one interaction at a time. They were rolling down Maple Street, a quiet, tree-lined road with small brick houses built in the 1960s when Sophie Chen came running out from her front yard 3 houses down. She was 9 years old, small for her age, with straight black hair pulled into a ponytail and the kind of serious expression that suggested she thought about things more deeply than most kids her age. She waved both arms over her head, flagging them down with the urgency of someone who had something important to say. Ridge pulled over, the other 5 bikes following his lead, engines idling while he kicked down his stand and pulled off his helmet. The girl was already talking before he could ask what she needed, words tumbling out in that breathless way kids have when they're worried about something but not sure if adults will take them seriously. "There's a lady in that house, the small brick one with the blue shutters, and I think something's wrong. Her mail has been piling up for 3 days, and her newspapers are still on the walkway, and I never see her anymore. She used to sit on her porch sometimes in the mornings, but I haven't seen her in weeks, and my mom said maybe she moved, but her car is still in the driveway, and the lights never come on at night. I think maybe she's hurt or sick or something, and nobody's checking on her." Ridge looked at the house Sophie was pointing to. Small brick ranch style, probably 1,200 square feet with faded blue shutters and a front porch that had seen better days. The mailbox was indeed overflowing, envelopes jutting out at odd angles. 3 newspapers in plastic sleeves were scattered on the walkway leading to the front door. The grass needed cutting. The whole place had that slightly neglected look that came when someone either didn't care anymore or couldn't manage the upkeep. But what struck Ridge was something else. The house felt empty in a way that went beyond just nobody being home. It felt forgotten. "What's the lady's name?" he asked Sophie, keeping his voice gentle. "Do you know her?" "Mrs. Voss. Eleanor Voss. She's really old, like Grandma old. She used to give me cookies when I was little and would wave when we walked by. But then she stopped coming outside, and my mom said we should leave her alone because old people like their privacy. But I don't think she's okay. I think she needs help, but she's too scared to ask." Ridge felt that familiar pull in his chest, the one that had led him to start the neighborhood patrol program in the first place. The recognition that sometimes the most vulnerable people were the ones nobody noticed because they'd learned to make themselves invisible. He looked at his brothers, saw his own concern reflected in their faces, and made a decision. "We'll check on her," he told Sophie. "You did the right thing telling us. That's exactly what we're here for." He walked up to the front door, aware of Sophie watching from her yard, aware of his brothers forming a loose semicircle behind him, providing backup in case this was something more serious than an elderly woman who'd stopped checking her mail. The porch boards creaked under his weight. Up close, he could see paint peeling from the door frame, a light fixture that had burned out and never been replaced, a doormat so faded the welcome was barely readable. He knocked, firm but not aggressive, the kind of knock that said someone official was here to help, not to cause trouble. No answer. He waited 30 seconds and knocked again. "Mrs. Voss, my name is Ridge Carter. I'm with the Heartland Riders Motorcycle Club. We do neighborhood patrols, and one of your neighbors mentioned they hadn't seen you in a while. We just want to make sure you're okay." Silence. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a voice from inside. "Go away. I'm fine. Leave me alone." The voice was thin, wavering, the kind that came from someone who was either very old or very weak or both. Ridge exchanged glances with Bear, his sergeant-at-arms, a massive man with a gray beard who'd been a paramedic before he joined the club. Bear shook his head slightly, his expression saying what Ridge was thinking. That didn't sound like fine. "Ma'am, I hear you, but your mail's been piling up for 3 days, and your newspapers are still on the walkway. That's not normal. I'm worried you might be hurt or need help. Can you come to the door so I can see you're okay?" Another long silence. Then, "I can't." Those 2 words hit Ridge harder than he expected. Not "I won't." Not "leave me alone." Just, "I can't," said with such defeated resignation that it made his chest ache. He tried the doorknob gently. Locked. He looked back at Bear, who was already on his phone. "Calling for a welfare check," Bear said quietly. "Fire department can do a forced entry if needed." Ridge nodded but kept talking through the door, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Mrs. Voss, I'm going to call the fire department to help us get inside and check on you. I know that might seem scary having strangers in your house, but we need to make sure you're safe. Can you tell me if you're hurt?" "I fell," the voice said, so quiet he had to press his ear against the door to hear. 3 days ago. I can't get up. My phone is in the kitchen. I tried to crawl, but I can't make it that far. I've been on the floor by the couch this whole time." Ridge felt his blood go cold. 3 days. This woman had been on the floor, unable to move for 3 days, while the entire neighborhood went about their lives, while mail carriers delivered mail, while newspaper deliveries happened, while people walked dogs and drove past and lived their normal lives completely unaware that someone was dying slowly just a few feet away behind a closed door. He put his hand flat against the door, as if he could somehow convey through wood and distance that she wasn't alone anymore, that help was here, that she mattered. "Eleanor, my name is Ridge. The fire department is on their way right now. They'll be here in about 5 minutes. I'm staying right here with you until they arrive, and I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone anymore. Do you understand? Help is here." He heard something that might have been a sob or might have been just breathing, and then that thin voice again. "Nobody's checked on me in 7 years. Not since my husband died. I didn't think anyone would notice if I was gone." Those words broke something in Ridge. 7 years. This woman had been living in isolation for 7 years, had become so invisible to her community that she'd been on the floor dying for 3 days, and the only person who'd noticed was a 9-year-old girl who still believed that paying attention to people mattered. He looked back at Sophie, who was still watching from her yard, her face tight with worry, and he thought about all the Sophies in the world who saw things adults had learned to ignore, who still believed that noticing someone's absence meant something, who hadn't yet learned that you could live next door to someone for decades and never really see them. The fire department arrived in 4 minutes, 3 firefighters and a paramedic who moved with practiced efficiency. They had the door open in 30 seconds, a controlled breach that didn't damage the frame more than necessary. Ridge followed them inside, his brothers staying on the porch to give the professionals room to work, but ready to help if needed. The house smelled stale, like air that hadn't circulated in weeks, like meals that had been eaten alone, like loneliness had a scent and it had settled into every corner. Eleanor Voss was on the floor, beside a worn couch in a living room that looked like it had been decorated in 1985 and never updated. She was tiny, couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, with white hair that had once been carefully styled but had gone flat and matted from 3 days on the floor. She wore a house dress and slippers, and her right leg was bent at an angle that made Ridge's stomach turn. Broken hip, probably, or worse. The paramedic was beside her in seconds, checking vitals, talking in that calm professional voice that paramedics use to keep patients from panicking. Ridge knelt down a few feet away, careful not to crowd her, but wanting her to see a face, to know she wasn't just a problem to be managed, but a person who mattered. Eleanor's eyes found his, pale blue and watery, but sharp with intelligence and something that looked like surprise. "You came," she said. "I heard you knocking and I told you to go away, but you came anyway. A little girl named Sophie noticed your mail piling up. She's the one who told us to check on you. She knew something was wrong." Eleanor's face crumpled. Sophie. The Chen's little girl. I used to give her cookies. I used to sit on my porch and wave at people. But after Harold died, I just stopped. Stopped going outside. Stopped answering the door. Stopped being part of the world. And eventually the world stopped noticing I existed. The paramedics were preparing to move her, calling for a stretcher, coordinating transport to the hospital. Ridge stayed close, his presence a steady anchor while medical professionals did their work. He saw what they were seeing. Severe dehydration, possible infection from lying in one position too long, obvious fracture that would require surgery. But he also saw what they might not see. The profound isolation, the kind that killed people just as surely as broken bones and dehydration, the erasure that happened when someone stopped mattering to anyone. Eleanor was loaded onto the stretcher, an IV already running, oxygen mask in place. As they wheeled her toward the door, she reached out a trembling hand toward Ridge. He took it gently, her bones feeling like bird wings under paper-thin skin. "Don't let them throw away Harold's things," she said, her voice muffled by the oxygen mask. "The house. Someone needs to." She couldn't finish, overwhelmed by medical intervention and fear and the sudden terrifying reality that her life as she knew it was over. "I'll make sure everything's taken care of," Ridge promised. "Your house will be secure. Nothing will be thrown away. You focus on getting better." They wheeled her out to the ambulance, neighbors starting to emerge from houses, now that emergency vehicles with lights and sirens had made the invisible visible. Sophie was at the fence line with her mother, a woman in her 30s who looked shaken by the realization that someone had been dying 3 houses down while life went on normally around them. Ridge walked over after the ambulance pulled away, Bear and the others securing Eleanor's house, making sure doors were locked and windows closed. "Is Mrs. Voss going to be okay?" Sophie asked, her eyes huge with worry. "She's going to the hospital. They'll fix her hip and get her healthy again. And she's going to be okay because you noticed she needed help. You saved her life today, Sophie. Do you understand that? If you hadn't told us about the mail and the newspapers, she might have died in that house and nobody would have known until it was too late." Sophie's mother put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her own eyes wet. "I told her we should mind our own business, that elderly people value their privacy. I taught my daughter to ignore someone who needed help." "You taught your daughter to be respectful," Ridge said gently. "But Sophie's right that noticing when something's wrong is important too. There's a difference between respecting privacy and letting someone disappear." Ridge spent the rest of that afternoon and evening piecing together Eleanor Voss's story from hospital social workers, from neighbors who suddenly remembered they hadn't seen her in months, from medical records that painted a picture of a woman who'd been slowly declining with no support system to catch her fall. Harold Voss had died 7 years earlier, a massive heart attack at 68 while mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. They'd had 2 children, a daughter who lived in Seattle and called maybe twice a year, a son who died in a car accident in his 20s. No grandchildren, no close friends left alive, no church community because Eleanor had stopped attending after Harold died, too grief-stricken to sit in the pew they'd shared for 40 years. She'd simply withdrawn into that small brick house and waited to die, and the world had been perfectly content to let her. The hospital social worker, a tired woman named Janet with kind eyes and the exhausted demeanor of someone who saw too many cases like this, met with Ridge in the family waiting area while Eleanor was in surgery. Broken hip, fractured pelvis, severe dehydration, early-stage bed sores from lying immobile for 3 days, possible pneumonia from aspiration. She'd survived the immediate injuries, but at 72, with no family support and a house she could no longer manage, Her future was uncertain at best. She'll need extended rehab, probably 3 to 6 months. After that, she can't go back to living alone. She needs assisted living at minimum, possibly skilled nursing care depending on how the recovery goes. Janet paused, looking at her notes with the kind of resignation that came from delivering bad news too many times. The problem is, she has no one. Her daughter returned my call and said she can't take her in, that she has her own family to worry about. There's no other family, no friends we can locate. Medicare will cover the medical care. But after rehab, she's looking at state placement in whatever facility has an opening. And those facilities, they're not places anyone would choose to spend their final years. Ridge thought about Eleanor's face when she'd said nobody had checked on her in 7 years, thought about Sophie noticing what an entire neighborhood had missed, thought about what it meant to become invisible while still being alive. He thought about his own mother, who'd died alone in a nursing home while he was deployed overseas, who'd spent her last month surrounded by strangers because her son was serving his country and her husband had left decades earlier. He'd carried that guilt for 20 years, had built the Heartland Riders community service programs partly as penance for all the times he hadn't been there when it mattered. This felt like a second chance at getting something right. What if she wasn't alone? Ridge said slowly. What if she had people checking on her, making sure she wasn't isolated? Janet looked at him with the weary skepticism of someone who'd heard promises before. Mr. Carter, that's kind of you, but elderly care requires more than occasional visits. It requires daily support, meal preparation, medication management, transportation to appointments, emergency response capability. It's a significant commitment, I understand that. But what if it wasn't just me? What if it was a community? Over the next 3 days, while Eleanor recovered from surgery, Ridge made calls. He contacted the Heartland Riders leadership, explained the situation, proposed something the club had never done before. Formal adoption of a community member who'd fallen through every social safety net, not as charity, but as an extension of what they already believed. That service meant showing up. That brotherhood extended to protecting the vulnerable, that a patch on your back meant you didn't look away when someone needed help. The vote was unanimous. Eleanor Voss would become the club's responsibility, their mother, their mission. They'd make sure she had what she needed, that she never spent another day invisible, that the last chapter of her life wouldn't be written in a state facility where she was just another bed number waiting to die. Ridge was there when Eleanor woke up fully from surgery, groggy and disoriented, her right leg immobilized in a brace. She looked at him with confusion at first, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "You're still here," she said, her voice raspy from intubation. "Why are you still here?" "Because you matter," Ridge said simply. "Because you're not alone anymore." He explained what the club was proposing, that they'd coordinate her care during rehab, make sure she had visitors, handle her house and belongings, work with social services to find her the best possible placement afterward, that Sophie had asked about her every day and wanted to visit, that an entire community had woken up to the realization that they'd let one of their own disappear and were determined not to let it happen again. Eleanor cried. Not delicate tears, but the kind of sobbing that came from 7 years of grief and isolation and the crushing weight of believing you didn't matter to anyone breaking apart all at once. Ridge sat beside her hospital bed and let her cry, this stranger who'd become his responsibility, this invisible woman who was visible now. The Heartland Riders established a rotation. Every day, Eleanor was in the hospital, and then through 3 months of rehab, she had visitors. Bear brought his wife Martha, who'd been a nurse and could translate medical jargon into plain English. Wrench brought books and read to her when her eyesight made the small print impossible. Spider brought his tablet and helped her video call with her daughter in Seattle. A conversation that started awkward and angry and slowly, over weeks, began to heal. Sophie came with her mother twice a week, bringing drawings and stories about school and the pure, uncomplicated affection of a child who didn't see a burden, just a lonely person who needed company. Ridge came every Sunday, bringing coffee from the place. Eleanor said Harold used to take her on Sunday mornings, sitting beside her while she did painful physical therapy, listening to her talk about the life she'd lived before grief had swallowed her whole. She'd been a teacher, 2nd grade, for 33 years. had loved her students, had kept boxes of their drawings and letters that she hadn't looked at in 7 years because the memories hurt too much, had loved Harold with the kind of fierce loyalty that made losing him feel like losing half of herself, had believed after he died that her purpose was finished, that she was just waiting out the clock until she could join him. "But here's what I'm learning," she told Ridge during one of those Sunday visits, 3 months into rehab when she was finally walking with a walker and talking about what came next. "I'm learning that grief doesn't mean your life is over. It means you loved someone enough that losing them tears you apart. But being torn apart doesn't mean you can't heal. It just means healing looks different than you thought it would." The Heartland Riders found Eleanor a spot in Cedar Hills, an assisted living facility that was clean and well-staffed and nothing like the state warehouses Janet had warned about. The club subsidized the cost that Medicare didn't cover through their charity fund, money they'd raised through toy runs and poker rallies and community events. They moved her in on a Saturday in early January. 6 bikes forming an escort as a medical transport van drove Eleanor from the rehab center to her new home. Her room was small but bright, with a window overlooking a garden and enough space for the belongings the club had carefully packed from her house. Photos of Harold, her favorite chair, books she'd loved, the quilt she'd made with her mother 40 years ago. Ridge had made sure she wasn't moving into a generic room, but into a space that held pieces of her life, reminders that she had history and love and a story that mattered. Eleanor cried again when she saw it, but different tears this time. Not grief, but gratitude so profound it overwhelmed her ability to express it. "You did this for me," she said to Ridge, to Bear, to the half-dozen club members who'd helped with the move. "You didn't even know me, and you did all of this." "We know you now," Ridge said, "and knowing you is a privilege." The Heartland Riders kept coming, not every day but regularly enough that Eleanor always had something to look forward to. They brought her to club events, made her an honorary member, gave her a vest with a rocker that said Club Mother. She wore it with fierce pride, this 72-year-old woman who'd been invisible for 7 years, suddenly visible again, claimed by a family she'd never expected, valued in ways she'd thought were finished forever. Sophie visited too, the little girl who'd noticed what no one else had, who'd flagged down a motorcycle club because she believed someone's absence mattered. Eleanor taught her to bake cookies using Harold's mother's recipe, supervised by assisted living staff in the community kitchen, passing down knowledge the way she'd once done with her students. Sophie brought school friends sometimes, children who saw in this elderly woman not a burden or someone to be pitied, but someone interesting who told good stories and made excellent snickerdoodles and listened like their words mattered. One year after Ridge knocked on Eleanor's door, the Heartland Riders organized a party at Cedar Hills, not just for Eleanor, but for all the residents, many of whom were just as isolated as she'd been, just as invisible to families who'd moved away or stopped calling. 24 bikers showed up with music and food and an afternoon of attention, of conversation, of treating elderly strangers like they were valuable and interesting and worth knowing. It became an annual tradition, then a monthly one, the club expanding their service beyond Eleanor to an entire community of people society had learned to ignore. Eleanor stood with Ridge during one of those events, watching Sophie play cards with an 80-year-old veteran who hadn't smiled in months, watching Bear dance carefully with a woman in a wheelchair, watching his brothers treat invisible people like they mattered because they did. "I was waiting to die," Eleanor said quietly. "For 7 years I was just waiting for it to be over. And then a little girl noticed my mail was piling up and you knocked on my door and didn't leave when I told you to go away. You gave me my life back. How do I thank someone for that?" "You keep living it," Ridge said. "You keep showing up. You keep mattering. That's all the thanks any of us need." 3 years after the rescue, Eleanor Voss stood at a Heartland Riders community event and told her story to a room full of people. How she'd become invisible after her husband died, how isolation had nearly killed her, how a 9-year-old girl's observation and a biker's decision to knock on a door had saved her life, how the last 3 years had been fuller and richer than she'd imagined possible, how being seen, really seen by people who chose to pay attention, had given her purpose again. The story spread through Cedar Rapids, then through Iowa, then beyond. Other motorcycle clubs started similar programs, adopting elderly community members who'd fallen through the cracks. Neighborhood watch programs added wellness checks to their protocols. Schools taught children that noticing when someone's routines change, when mail piles up or lights stay off or a familiar face stops appearing, was important. That paying attention to the people around you wasn't being nosy, it was being human. Sophie, now 12 years old and volunteering regularly at Cedar Hills, told everyone who would listen about Mrs. Voss, about how one small act of noticing had saved a life. She'd learned that her voice mattered, that children could see things adults missed, that speaking up even when you weren't sure anyone would listen was worth the risk because sometimes someone did listen. Sometimes that listening changed everything. Ridge kept that Sunday morning coffee date with Eleanor until she died peacefully in her sleep at 79, 7 years after she'd been found on her living room floor. She died surrounded by photos of Harold, holding the hand of a Heartland rider who'd been keeping vigil in a room that smelled like the cookies she'd baked with Sophie that afternoon. She died visible, claimed, valued, loved by a community that had chosen to see her. Her funeral drew 200 people, bikers and assisted living residents and neighbors and children she'd taught decades earlier, who'd heard she'd passed and came to pay respects. The Heartland Riders buried her with full honors, her coffin draped with her Club Mother vest, engines roaring in final salute to a woman who'd taught them that service meant more than charity runs and toy drives. It meant noticing the invisible people. It meant knocking on doors even when voices inside said, "Go away." It meant believing that everyone deserves to matter, that isolation kills just as surely as broken hips, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to let someone disappear. Sophie spoke at the funeral, 12 years old and clear-voiced, telling the story of how she'd noticed mail piling up and newspapers on a walkway and had trusted that observation enough to flag down a motorcycle club. How Mrs. Voss had taught her that paying attention to people, really paying attention, was one of the most important things humans could do for each other. How being seen, truly seen, by even one person could save a life. If you believe that noticing matters, that the elderly deserve dignity and connection, that communities are strongest when they refuse to let anyone become invisible, take a moment to share this story. Subscribe to hear more about ordinary people who choose to pay attention, who knock on doors, who believe that every person deserves to know they matter. Tell us in the comments about someone you've noticed who seemed invisible to everyone else. Your awareness could save a life. Your attention could be the thing that reminds someone they're not forgotten. Because Eleanor Voss taught us that being seen, really seen, is sometimes all the rescue someone needs.